Hi, John. Hi, everyone.
Hey, Hannes.
Yeah.
Does your presence mean you've actually made it, or might you fall off at some point?
No. I'm good. I can take notes.
That'd be great. You'll see I've opened the Hedge doc already and just put a quick header up with the agenda.
Excellent. I guess we'll need to wait a few minutes for folks to join.
Yeah.
I hope that I don't think there's anything special today, but I'm not entirely sure everyone has seen the update to the meeting invite.
I think it seemed about.
Have seen it.
It seemed about the same as the last. What was changed? Because it seemed about the same.
Say that again, Ray.
Okay. All right. There we go. What changed? Because it seemed about the same to me.
Was there what the time, the start time, that changed? Like the start time now.
Maybe it's because we're on daylight savings time here or something. 8 o'clock was when it normally. Oh, maybe I can't remember. But
no, you're right, Ray. So what happened was it was always 8 o'clock, and then after 1:16 we took a vote, and the initial vote won and took it back to 6 a.m. And after that, and it was all set up, people suddenly realized, hell, that's kind of early. We'd rather put it back to 8 a.m. And so we put it back. So the net change is that it's the same as it always was, but there was some organizational fact in the middle.
Okay, so all right, that helps me because I studied that and said, okay, well, it's changed, but I don't see what. I'm glad that we changed. We changed from the 6 a.m. Thank you so much.
I think this is more effective for sure. So I was rather hoping, I don't know if we can get started anyway, it's 3 past now. I was kind of hoping that we'd have Roy and Cedric because they are the most vocal and the most keen to discuss registration policies this week. And they're currently not here, but we can make other progress.
Well, maybe they are joining a little later, so doesn't mean anything.
Okay. So the agenda for today, very quick recap and closeout of last week. We discussed and I think kind of agreed the hackathon topic for 117, but I see there's been some discussion on the mailing list, so it'd be good to have a quick chat about that. And then the plan was to move on to registration policies, which I'm still happy to do, even with or without those other folks. Does anyone else have any AOB or emerging issues that we'd like to do some agenda hacking on, or are we good to go?
Yeah. One note on the hackathon.
Yeah.
I have so last time I asked who is interested to participate at the hackathon and do some preparation work, and I sent out an email to those who expressed interest. So if you like Eduardo and Dick and Ray, but if there are others, happy to include them in the email. But I just don't want to spam everyone who is not interested in trying.
This is Dick Brooks. So John and I met last Thursday, and he did a demo of what they'd done on the hackathon, the previous hackathon, and he has some really good materials in there. I'm convinced that REA can easily implement what John showed from a consumer standpoint, where we would query a transparency service. So I think we're in a pretty good shape for actually contributing to that. Thanks.
Yeah, I rewatched the John's presentation because at the last IETF meeting it was terribly early for me, but yeah, I think we have a very good foundation, but there's still a chance to do a little bit more interop testing. The SCITT receipt stuff has evolved. If we now look at the sort of a full event scenario, I think that also requires a little bit of work. So I think there's room for everyone to contribute.
Yeah, one potential use case is actually in line with something that's actually happening for real. Ian Neuberger from the United States White House Cybersecurity Office has suggested that, in using an analogy, a restaurant cleanliness score analogy, as a means to communicate trustworthiness for software. And so that's a use case that we could easily demonstrate, where a consumer could query for a score and receive the results back. And John basically showed that that's something that could happen today using a SHA-256 hash value as a query. So I think we're in really good position to make something real, to show something real. So this is a good opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Dick. So I really ought to record that and put it on YouTube, make it easier for people to see, as well as just having the code hidden away on GitHub. But yeah, thanks. I agree. I think this suggests potentially 2 strands or 3 strands at the hackathon, and I hope we're not too thin for that. But it seems like there's a spec hacking, obviously. Some folks just working on the architecture, and there was also some discussion on the mailing list about use case expansion, which probably counts into there. There's the topic we discussed last week, and I think it is still the most pressing topic for the spec, which is registration policies, and really seeing if we can get interoperable registration policies, which is more of a kind of technology layer use case. And then, as you say, it will be very compelling, and I think it will help us a lot if we can also have one of these user level, application level use cases like the trust scores built on top to show that it actually kind of works in the real world. It feels like we're gravitating towards those 3.
I think that was missing last time, at least I didn't hear it. I would like to add some of that DID discussion, or specific aspects to the whole setup. We talked about it at the call, but I don't think you guys touched on that, did you?
Not for the hackathon topic, no.
Okay, cool. Mm-hmm.
No, there's a big so interestingly, so there was a discussion on the mailing list about DIDs and DID references being persistent or not, or public keys being persistent or not, which is all very important stuff. And I think something that we haven't covered very well yet is, and will absolutely come out with the registration policies topic, is the difference between evaluating identity right now for the purposes of authorizing the creation of a claim versus the evaluation of an identity at some unknown point in the future to work out who made that claim and what authority upon which they did so. And these are very different questions in some cases, and speak to why intermediate CA type things and hosting questions are all very asymmetrical. So yeah, I would hope that all of those topics will come out and be covered, but you never know, so it's good to mark them explicitly.
Yeah, and thank you, Ray, for your detailed response or clarification regarding the question about the public keys in the receipts. That was very helpful.
And Hans, I'll let everyone know, I did drop a link in the chat to the presentation. It's an article with a link to Ann Newberger's presentation, where she talks about the funding of this course. So that's in the chat.
So John,
Thank
one
you.
quick question. The video you mentioned in the YouTube, is it part of the IETF presentations, or is this some link which you would like to share on the chat so that we can also?
Yeah. So there's, if you look at last week's meeting, the hedge doc for last week's meeting has a link to a YouTube time stamp, which is the start. So that's the entire IETF-SCITT meeting, the entire 2 hours of it. But the timestamp starts you at the hackathon readout, which is about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So there's that. In addition, a thing that I showed Dick and a thing that I presented at the hackathon has a, I don't know if you've seen them before, but they had a sort of meet and greet evening with wine and demonstrations. So what I showed Dick and what I showed at the demonstration evening was it actually working in real commercial product with other, open source IETF code at both ends and a commercial service in the middle. That isn't in the YouTube on the meeting because I don't think it's appropriate for me to be showing off my product in the IETF meeting.
Sure.
But I could also, I think it would be useful to show that, especially as I'm not the only one anymore. It would be useful to also post that somewhere, so I might get onto that this week.
Okay. Yeah, just outside the context of IETF, maybe if it is worth making public, then that would also help the community in some way, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah, and the client API, just to be clear for anyone who's not clear, the client API is all derived from the SCITT architecture. So there's nothing specific. There's no like using my proprietary APIs or anything like that. It just happens to be you need to have a service and a database in the cloud somewhere to make it work, and that's mine.
Oh, okay. Okay. But and it has a very simple registration policy, or that has yet to be a policy?
Well, that has yet to be done. So we
Okay.
actually have, in my product, we have extremely complex registration policies, but they're not standardized yet. So standardizing those and getting an idea of how those work is what we agreed last week should be the next sort of big topic to get our teeth into.
Thank you.
I just posted the link to the meeting minutes from last week. So just in case, Yogesh, you want to look at that video, just a video from the IETF meeting, still very useful.
We'll have a look. Yeah.
Well, it looks like I can answer my own hand. I think we can make good progress on the public key question, like we're going on now on the list, so we can continue that there. I just had a question about DID, and to me, it seemed like it was a cheeseless rat hole. In other words, I don't think that standard will become followed. But that's my initial, very cursory review. Does anyone have more information in terms of, is it being embraced at all? And because it seems like it sort of attacks the problem the wrong way. And I thought that the package URL, the Perl things, were much more along the lines of what we would need for identifying things that along those lines versus the DID, which seems to lump way too much into the ID. That's my question.
So I have one answer, but if anybody is in the queue, then pardon me, I can wait.
No, I think you were next in the queue, so go for it.
So yes, to answer Ray's question, I think DidWeb is a evolving specification, but it is being adopted by W3C, I suppose, for verified credentials working group in W3C. and I think few more standard bodies do use DID. So I think Ori is not here, but he is the best person because he's very active in W3C working group on this subject, so he would shed more light. But I can certainly tell that DID has been adopted in other standard bodies. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
So it's been adopted. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I think
Adopted.
Yes,
we have
yes.
to be careful when we say like adopted. Like ideally, you want to have adoption in terms of deployments, not by. There's this
Yeah.
common practice in standards development. You create all these adoption circles among standards groups to sort of like to raise the importance of something, right? But sometimes that helps, and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. I will. We can put that question aside since there's no quick answer, and then attack it later. But sometimes I see this, where there'll be some really good work done, a whole lot of infrastructure planned around it and so forth, and then it doesn't get adopted because it doesn't quite fit what the needs are. And whereas I see, yeah. So anyway, that's what I thought about it. I mean,
Makes total sense.
and I'm
Ray,
still
think,
just.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, so that's the end of my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. I believe it would be good to identify like what are some of the most important sort of information elements we need to have in our systems, and then finding out what technology sort of fits the needs best would be appropriate, I guess. I don't have a strong opinion about this DIDs and so on, but that's why I was interested in reading through it and understanding and how some of the DID methods sort of fit into this larger SCITT picture.
Yeah, well, the reason I say what I said is because I thought that that in my scanning of it, the DID thing goes much further than what we would need because it lumps in a whole lot of things such as signatures and so forth. And also, I had some problem with how they had arranged it with their thinking that everything was going to be available on the internet to anyone at all times. Maybe not, but I mean, so I'm still sort of cautiously making these statements. I could be wrong, and I may reverse myself, but that I just wanted to tell you that was my. And a lot of times I'm very right about these things, but sometimes very wrong. So I thought that the PURL stuff was going to be very handy and easy to use and deploy, and looks like it already has traction. Whereas the DID stuff, I just don't think it's going to have that same level of deployment and traction because it doesn't leverage stuff that's already there. The PURL, the Perl stuff is leveraging the package namespaces that already exist. And so nothing has to be, all they have to do is just use those namespaces, done. And it can also be maybe turn toward some proprietary namespaces. I don't know if they have that in there, but a manufacturer has their own namespaces that they want to define. And that whole thing can work fine. It doesn't have to, because we don't need them to be as secured because that's what SCITT is providing. So we don't need that level of mechanisms of the DID. But okay. Thank you for the answer, and I'll continue to research it myself. Thanks.
John, you're in the queue. Is that intentional? John?
It was, yes. It was
Okay.
a question. It may be a question also to, well, anybody actually on the call, but particularly Bob Martin as well, who will have seen this. A couple of questions. So PURL for software packages and identifying, if we're just doing SBOMs and vexes and things, I see that. But we're also trying to identify people and organizations and potentially machine actors as well, because this all ties into who is making these claims, not just what the claims are about. So question the first is, have I missed some development in PURL that makes it suitable for identifying arbitrary actors? And a second and possibly related question is, I used to spend quite a lot of time hanging out in the SBOM meetings, particularly the CISA working groups, but also the pre-CISA working groups when 14028 was new, and also some of the various community groups around that. And the topic of naming and identifying software and using PURL was very quickly seized upon, but then seemed to go round in long circles about whether it was actually useful and how to use it. Because semantics and syntax are different, and globally versus locally uniqueness are different. So I don't know, Ray or anybody else, if you've observed those conversations and they actually made some breakthroughs that we can rely on, or whether my concerns are founded or not.
No, I think your observations are correct in that I didn't notice them extending the PURL paradigm to allow for proprietary namespaces, but it would be easy to do so, and then
Right.
we would have something that would work for everything. So that's what I had in my mind. Whereas when I looked at DID, I just didn't see how it would be as quick to do that. Both have to be adapted.
I would like to interject here that I was
Right.
talking to William Bartholomew over the last 3 months or 4 months over this. He did indicate there was progress made on Perl to allow us to address some of these issues. And I just need to move further ahead with that and maybe loop everybody else in those regards. So I don't think all is lost here.
Cool, thank you.
Dick, you're next in the queue.
Thank you, Hannes. So I'm going to go the same direction that John went. I know when I worked on the NTIA SBOM work, there was a lot of discussion about naming and so forth. And it came down to, it really takes 3 data elements to identify a unique piece of software product. And it's a supplier name, the assigned product name by that supplier, and the version. And those 3 components represent sort of the primary key. Perl, it was discussed, but it didn't really, as far as I recall, it wasn't really established as one of the minimum elements that NTIA chose. One other area to look for maybe some guidance on this. CISA has announced their self-attestation form. This is what software suppliers will need to communicate to the federal government to indicate that they are following NIST guidance standards. And there is no requirement for Perl in that document, but information about identifying the supplier and products and versions are indeed the elements that are expected to be present. Thanks.
Thanks, Dick. Charlie?
Can you hear me? Looks like you can. So I feel like I'm up to my neck in this and current on all the issues. So I can probably provide a quick summary if that's useful. So first one is that NTIA provided for this sort of loose agglomeration of fields as Dick described. They also provided for a field called software identifier, which was one of 3 things: a GUID or a UUID, a Perl, or I can't remember the third thing. But so there are some possible unique values. However, there is no guidance on which to use, and there is no guidance on the source of authority for any of those, etc. Now, other groups have basically declared Perl to be the winner in that, and I believe they've done that prematurely and without considering some of the implications of it. Perl in particular will really not work for proprietary software. So I don't think that problem is solved at all. And I think that solving it is a big deal. So we can attempt to move further down the road on that, or we can just say, okay, we'll take whatever identifier is, is provided by the supplier and call it a day, which is what I would advise. Over.
Thanks, Charlie. Roy?
Yeah, the follow-up to that, Charlie, is the same thing, which is you can rebuild the product N times. The SBOM will probably be the same. The Perl will potentially be the same point of the source code, but the evidence that we do for monitoring how the build is happening and filed, that would be a per instance that you spin the build and the machines it runs on and everything else, which is why the GUID or UID approach for a unique identifier kind of resonated with me, because I can rebuild Windows NT even today. It doesn't mean it's the same thing as we shipped.
Exactly. And so actually I thought of the third, which is CPE, which has many of the same issues. So the build. So I mean, your SBOM is going to change every time you have timestamp added to it, but there could be no content change whatsoever, including the identifier, just as Roy points out.
Yeah. Right. And in our case, we see variations depending on architecture and scheme. We call it Windows 11, but there's N versions of the damn thing, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
So the only
build
thing
will capture only some of that. Yeah, build number.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Which is why when all these discussions of unique identifiers, it's going to be a while to land on it. There's still value for Perls at certain points, and I'm not discounting those. And I think we'll end up having cases where we say, this is the way we're going to solve this problem. But for evidence for specific product and everything else, I struggle for Perls.
Yeah, Perl's only good if you can get at the build kit on the net somewhere.
Yeah,
basically, right? So so Git stuff in open source.
Hey, Charlie, you still have your hand up.
He's trying to figure out how to put it down now. There we go.
Dick, you're next.
Thank you, Hannes. My findings, I find that Charlie's findings match what I found as well. That Perl has some issues with regard to proprietary software. He also brought up the CPE as another one. Of course, CPE is ambiguous. You can use multiple CPE identifiers to refer to the same piece of software. So as far as the NTIA minimum elements go, the software ID is not one of the required minimum elements, but the supplier name, the product name, and the version are indeed required if you want to be in line with the SBOM minimum elements. Thank you.
The question there is that just because of the way they think they're tracking software, or they just haven't got to the trying to get that individual information. I can understand a GUID doesn't get you anywhere, where the other three get you at least to a producer and a set of responsible parties, but it's not unique enough when you start looking at evidence and CVEs and so forth.
Yeah, they basically decided to punt, threw up their hands, and made it optional.
Yeah, and just to your point, Roy, I think what you'll find is that vendors want to be in charge of their own namespace when it comes to naming products and versions. Some like to use semantic versioning, some don't. Some use hash values. So there's no guarantee that a name will be unique or an identifier will be unique without having a central authority to ensure uniqueness. So by using the three elements and letting the supplier be the authority and naming what they want and assigning versions to where they want, it makes them the owners of the unique namespace that they are responsible for. Thanks.
Software supplier, Dick.
No, I'm sorry, we've got some background noise, but normally that's the way it's done. I wouldn't expect any, the vendors to change their names or something or go through an authority. But the only thing you have to do, and it's typically done, is you have to have the vendor name be the thing that is the only thing that is, past, that has to be unique. And then after that, you can do anything you want, almost anything you want. Plus, we're not really constrained to use a single line of a single string. We can use a JSON block and have whatever we want in there, similar to what you would have in a descriptor of a container. So anyway, my question though is there anything written up about, or is there, what is the status of considering these things? Is there something written up about the concerns for proprietary software and products with regard to Perl or the other options?
I can comment on that, I think, absent anybody else who wants to jump in. Yeah, the Perl folks are a large contingent of OSS suppliers and related folks like the Linux Foundation, and they have sort of declared victory that Perl is the unique identifier. It really isn't, and their stating so hasn't made it so, and hasn't increased adoption as far as I can tell. So it is not written up. It's all optional, and CISA is aware of this, NIST is aware of this, and everybody's trying to scratch their heads and figure out how to get out of it. I do believe at some point there will be a USG-sponsored project to better identify software, and it may very well proceed with the attestation stuff that Dick was talking about, because right now it's a mess, and that's not a good way for regulations to be promulgated.
Thanks, Charlie. But I'm wondering, specifically circling back to where we came from, or at least where Ray's question came from, was initially about sort of the DIT topic and whether that's, and then we jumped over to the Perl topic. But I believe they are two orthogonal things.
Yes.
But orthogonal, and so I think right now, I would find it important to just, like we have the discussion on the mailing list, to find out like what are some of the information elements we need in all the different requests and responses, and then to find out like what would be the best tool to stick in there. And at least so far we have sort of been working with the DITs, and they're highly customizable. Like just some structures, and so I think particularly given the hackathon, I think we can prepare something and then gain some experience and see how it's going. But Ori also said last time that the whole process in the W3C is a little bit convoluted and long and so on, and so it's not entirely clear on when they will be able to finish the work on some of the DIT methods, which is a challenge for us, I think. Okay, enough rambling. Charlie.
Charlie, you're muted.
I think there is no real solution that we can get to realistically, and we just have to work with the imperfect possibilities we have. And I think the fully qualified vendor software name, software version, build version, etc., is probably the best information we could use right now.
So there's a slightly different thought here, right? So for the DID, we have to potentially think of which method we want to focus on. Is it DID web? Is it DI? And is it DID some other new protocol? And even limiting and reducing that section is highly valuable. And we can make progress with DID web. It's much simpler starting point. I wouldn't pick ION or some of the other ones like DID SEC. I don't think works in our scenario. But that said, the cases for Perl, I think, are disconnected from the DID discussion. If I have an SBOM, forget what's in it, and I have evidence, the fact that I don't want to put the evidence in the public domain means I may need something like a Perl to say, hey, if you ask for this at a fiduciary level, you can now retrieve it, because some of the information that they're asking to retrieve is potentially a map to how to compromise the product. Right? If you do static analysis and see where it sees problems, it basically is giving the bad guys a head start. And maybe what we'll end up doing is allowing for a redirection in that type of evidence to additional stores that require different permissions. And that's where I see Perl being an interesting conversation.
Thanks, Ray. Ori, thanks for joining, Ori.
Yeah, so I mean, in the context of identifiers for things, I was implementing RFC 9162 over the weekend, and they have a URN registry for transparent parameters. And I wondered whether there had been any discussion about building on that registry in SCITT yet. Like, have we talked about, because IETF has URNs for all kinds of things. Some of my favorites are identifiers for keys, like the JWK thumbprint URN RFC. So it's possible that we could use these URNs to identify artifacts that by content, right? So you can say, here's the SHA-256 of this particular content, and here's the IETF URN for content that matches that hash. So I just wanted to ask, like, has anyone been thinking about extending the transparency URN registry? Because right now it has like basically just error codes for certificate transparency in it, as far as I can tell. That's it.
Ori, have you said RFC 9162, which is the certificate transparency? Is that correct?
Yeah, I put a link in the chat too, directly to the thing I'm talking about.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll add that to the meeting minutes. Yeah. Well, I can say I haven't, but maybe someone else did. John, did you?
Yeah, I'll put in a small vote for looking at ways of incorporating 9162, if for no better reason than that it is also based on Merkle tree inclusion proofs and just gives us a bigger community of people using that proof method. Beyond that, what I was wanting to say, and thanks, Ori, for joining, and everyone else who came later on. I think what we're trying to get to in terms of work item progress here is unpicking all of the issues that are in the way of defining our registration policies work, and all of these various different ways of identifying things is just one of those core items. And I wonder, actually, if we take from that point of view that we're looking at registration policies, I'm not sure that SCITT itself needs to be very prescriptive, because I think you can have a registration policy in some services that say, we don't care, just give us an email address and we're done, all the way through to, we've done a full proof of possession out of band key exchange and sent lawyers around to look at your company registration documents. And there will be different types of identity. I think it's very important that we have hard rules on the fact that things are identified, but it may well turn out that the technology used is more a side effect of what, forgive me, I forget, I think it was Ray, forgive me if I'm wrong, was mentioning last week. Then actually the important thing for us to specify is that audits and checks and identity verification have been done to some level, as opposed to exactly how they were done. And we might be able to just avoid some of these really hard technical questions that way.
Since we have Ori on the call, I was wondering whether we could talk a little bit about how the registration policies, at least, so whether there's some commonality between what you, John, have been doing in implementing and what Ori has been working on, to find out whether there's a sort of like an intersection that we could potentially document somewhere in the whatever document, architecture document or another document. John, do you want to go first? Or you're still
Not necessarily, no.
Ori. Ori, you
Can't hear you, Ori.
Yep, sorry. Finishing typing and yeah. So my primary interest in SCITT is to understand the envelope format and how you verify an envelope has been signed by a particular entity. And so for the systems that I've been working on in relationship to SCITT, I've been using the ISS field and the KID field, and I've been using DIDs for the ISS field. And that causes you to need to resolve key material as part of the registration policy, because you have a signed statement coming in, it's signed by something. How do you know that you trust the signature from that something? So you need a policy file that looks at the issuer and KID, gets to key material, and can make a decision on whether the signature is originating from that issuer or not. And so I've been implementing that with Rego and sort of looking at how might we ship a sort of standard registration policy for ecosystem components that build on top of DID. And I think it's not that hard to do it with Rego today, as long as you use JSON web keys and you use JSON and you use Jose. But there's also support in Rego for certificates. And so it's not totally unreasonable that you might have Rego policies for registration in one transparency service that rely on certificates, and policies in another transparency service that rely on DIDs, but only support, some DIDs, and then a different one that maybe supports a different set of DIDs. And so I think the relationship between the registration policy engine languages, and the envelope formats, like, for the most part, it's not really our business to say what policy language you use, but every policy language will look at the envelope formats to make decisions. And so we do have a responsibility to document, the most popular ways of identifying, issuers for signed statements. And then I think on the outbound side as well, when you have a transparency service and it's making, signed statements transparent, it would be really smart for us to make that identity system kind of compatible with the same inbound identity system. So if you were in the DID web ecosystem, transparency service would sign with DID web and issuers would submit with DID web. Like that's one sort of simple case. You could have the transparency service sign with certificates and the issuers all kind of come in with DIDs. And I think, that's fine to support, but it would be nice to have some parity and a single sort of recommended way of doing things for SCITT. The RFC 9162 covers a massive amount of space, and it also covers signing and REST APIs and Merkle tree proofs. And so I think there is a sort of minimum set of things you need to bundle together to get to the point where you've made the experience easy for developers. That's it.
So, Ori, I have a question there. So is the stuff that Microsoft Entra has done for wrapping X509 into DID a way to kind of normalize and move forward, or do you think it's still a wrong approach?
So I think it can be a way to move forward. I'm not sure how mature that particular DID method is. I think, if you're using X509 today and you don't want to upgrade to DIDs, you should not have to use SCITT. Like, things should work. But then someone needs to sit down and explain how does that work and make it really easy. I'm not volunteering to do that for X509, but I'm totally volunteering to do that for DIDs. So that's sort of.
Have you talked to Christina yet?
Yeah, I mean, I have a meeting with her later today, possibly in a few minutes.
Can you ask her to do that?
To ask her to normalize their DID X509 method into a generic DID structure.
Or just document how X5, if you want to do the DID and she can do the X509, I think that gives us in a good position.
I will ask her. I'm fairly sure that every time you ask anyone to do anything with X509, they unvolunteer themselves. That's sort of the whole point, isn't it?
Yeah, well, Christina asked to help us with SCITT, so.
Yeah. Can you repeat on what specifically you want to sort of find out in that relationship, in that context?
I think when we're documenting how we expect X509, whether you have to have the intermediate certificate chains in the signature, in how that's represented, in why going to DID would be a strategic thing going forward. I think somebody, as Ori says, has to document how we expect it to be used.
Right, but does anyone in Cozy actually use X5C and X5U? Like, are those header parameters used ever?
I have to go look at what we did for Notary, but I can't answer that until
if they are, then the process of sort of verifying the X509 path is sort of the same as it is for DIDs. It's just with a different set of header parameters you use to make the evaluation. Instead of looking at ISS and KID, you look at the certificate chain and you have some way of trusting that this particular, root cert is worthy, and therefore all of the intermediates and the signature on the final object are acceptable to you.
Yeah, I think.
But that verification process is usually it's not supported in off-the-shelf libraries for Hosey, and I would be surprised if it's supported in off-the-shelf libraries for Hosey as well.
I think those are two separate questions. One is the question about is it difficult to do, technically, and the other one is who has implemented it or deployed it. Very different things. I think it's easy to do technically, but I haven't seen it being implemented, at least not in the libraries I have been using.
I'm pretty sure we did document this, how we were going to do this for the container registries. So let me go see if I can find that documentation.
Technically, I think it's easy to do, but practically, it's not so easy to do.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's why it's not.
But I think the Notary guys put it into practice, right? So we have something we can lean on.
Yeah, please. Nick, I think you are in the queue for quite a while now. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Hannes. No problem. Oh, it's good conversation. I think one of the things what I heard Ori say, and I agree with, is you want to verify the integrity of the party that that is signing. But the other factor too, and the CAB forum is actually coming around to this and voting on this recently, is the notion that even a valid party can end up becoming an invalid signature on a program. So it's not enough to just validate that the party is legitimate. We also have to validate that the key and the certificate that was used to sign is still valid. And the scenario they give is that, someone has signed some software. Turns out that there's some malware in the software, aka SolarWinds, and it turns out that you really shouldn't be trusting the certificate that was used to sign that piece of software. So that's the other factor that needs to be considered here: is the party legitimate, and is the key still valid, and the certificate still valid that signed it. And we tried to address this with the first use case when we said is still valid. And that's really going back to the need to look up on a revocation list or some other means like OSCP or something to look for invalidated certificates.
So Dick, the SolarWinds attack wasn't that the key was compromised. They just injected it into the build pipeline. And the whole premise of what they're trying to do with secure supply chain moves it away from the certificate needs to be revoked versus you can now make a negative endorsement or a claim against an existing product to target one or end products. The revoking of a key means that every product that was ever signed with it is now suspect, and that's not necessarily the granularity we want going forward.
Yeah, I agree with you, Roy. I think right now it's a hammer, and you need something that's much closer to, a sewing needle to get this right? Because
Correct.
You need to be more granular.
Yeah,
but unfortunately, right now, what we have in the public key infrastructure space is what we have, and that's, it's a hammer, unfortunately. But I know what you mean.
But Dick, isn't that exactly what they're trying to do with removing just self endorsement? They basically want third-party endorsements as a way to solve that problem, and that's where they're moving with supply chain. I'm not arguing that there has to be the hammer capability somewhere, right? You still need to be able to revoke these things, but the 90%, 99% case should be a negative endorsement, not a revocation of a certificate.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement, Roy, because these things they can be ephemeral, right? I mean, you can one day it's good, the next day it's bad. So recognizing that reality is what we deal with. However, you don't want to implement the methods that say today it's good, tomorrow it's bad. However we want to do that is okay. I'm just making you aware that the guys over on the CAB forum side are using a hammer to do this, and so just be aware that that's coming, and I think we'll have to deal with it at some level.
I have no problem with the scenario of yesterday it was good, today it was bad. The one I don't like is yesterday it was good, today we have no clue because the certificate expired and we can't tell you whether it was ever revoked. That's the one that's really a fly in the ointment here. Right? The fact that something got in and we didn't detect it means that allowing it to be bad later on is perfectly viable way to move forward.
I think we're in agreement again. I think what you're saying is that if a certificate is allowed to expire, that you really shouldn't be trusting it if it's used to sign material after the expiration date. I agree, but while it was valid, it's still valid. So
right. That's the whole point of why SCITT countersigns is to say, hey, we checked it at the time it was submitted to give it life going forward. And yeah, you got it.
And that's why you just can't rely on the duration, the start and end date of the certificate. You really have to see, has this thing been revoked because someone has discovered something that shouldn't be, that has challenged its trustworthiness. So that both are very important, as you know. Thanks.
Quick question about you guys' conversation. The hammer is the revocation, and that is too big of a hammer. I assume that's what you're saying. Then, and you know what? This is very much like the voter database situation, and most people think the voters are deleted from them, but they're not allowed to be. They're forced to be maintained, and you can mark them as not active, but you don't get to delete it. So same thing with these certificates. There should be there should not just be a revoke and no trail. There should be if there is some sort of a hammer that's applied, it should be documented along with their certificate. And if
Right.
but if that mechanism doesn't exist, then that's certainly
Actually,
a big problem.
There is a mechanism, as Ori's pointed out, that we can leverage in a DID document to say something was revoked, and it has longer life than CA curls or OCSP problem. So the DID document gives us a little bit of breathing room to support the scenario. I think in the night, there's two extremes here, Ray. There's the very short-lived one-use signing certificates, and then you end up with a whole haystack of signatures that you're trying to assume that are the same or slightly different, and spotting an outlier can be really problematic. Versus the other one is we use the same signing key for the next 50 years. There's got to be somewhere in the middle of that. And there's certain scenarios where, hey, we want to be able to target an existing product and say, hey, there is OSS code or something else that got in here. There's nothing wrong with the signature of the product, but we just want to denote the product as an issue. And that's where the normal endorsement style or claim style on a specific target needs a finer tool than a hammer of revocation. There's still the classical, the keys from Intel or Western Digital were stolen, blah, blah, blah. How do you now, since you don't know, maybe you just going to revoke the whole damn thing? And that's the hammer approach. There's still various scenarios for that.
Okay, thanks a lot. That helped me a lot, and especially that comment about how the DID document is helpful. Thanks.
Before we run completely out of time, Ori, you posted a link to a tutorial you gave, or some write-up. In what context, or which context does this fit in terms of the meeting minutes discussion?
So the question was sort of like, how do you verify certificates? If you have did web and you also want to check certificate chains, how do you do that? And so we put together this tutorial using OpenSSL that showed one way to do it. But, again, like, it's like how to use DIDs with certificates is not super well defined. And if you just, most of what's in that tutorial is just like using libraries that exist around various places to check signatures and to check the chain of signatures on a particular token. So it shows like how you could use did web with certificates together if you wanted to, but most of the time any entity processing a did web signed statement would ignore the certificate chain because they have no reason to understand it, because that's not a thing that anyone's really doing. And similarly, on the certificate side, how you check that chain tends to be very application specific. And so you're unlikely to kind of get general off-the-shelf certificate chain verification in common, audited, well-used libraries. So it's a tutorial. It was a demo. It was exploration. It's filled with security holes. Don't take it to production. But if you're interested in certificate chain verification and did web resolution sort of together, it's a thing to look at.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, that's much appreciated. Thanks, Ori.
Okay, and we're actually running to the end. Charlie, are you still in the queue, or is that the leftover? Charlie?
Keep forgetting to get off mute. Very quickly, identity is different from the certificate or the key or the representation of it, right? There's a verifiable identity at the root of all these things, and we have to be able to figure out a way to reflect that. Certificates are inadequate right now, the way they're revoked and managed and expired and so forth. But the bottom line is that we need a way to establish the identity of that underlying entity. And there are ways that individuals, like fingerprints and retina scans and face scans and so forth. For companies, there are probably similar methods, that involve going to the registrars in various countries, whatever. So we should be thinking about, in my view, how to kind of get back to that verifiable identity and making sure that the certificate reflects the owner of that identity.
Months ago, I distributed a link to a NIST document that was written or co-authored by some IETF people and of course NIST folk. And I think that provided a lot of good terminology and background and architecture. And I think that's something we should probably reread again, because it will help us to see that regardless of what name of technology and encoding of the formats we use, there are some underlying challenges that don't go away. And I think there's just, we have to live with them. They are sort of like, they're trade-offs. You can make it easy on one hand, but then it will get more complicated on the other side. And I think that's recognizing that, I think, would be very important. I will try to dig out that link again and post it to the mailing list.
Yeah, I'll take a look too. Ray's voter analogy, I think, is excellent. The voter didn't go away. The voter's still there, or the identity of the voter at least is. They just, their certificate's not valid anymore, so they have to re-up it, but they still exist. So that's going to be important, especially if you look at software that is long-lived and successor companies and all of that crap. So just
the one thing I wanted to add to Charlie is I truly believe products have their own signature. It isn't a human. Basically, the maintainers control the repo and hit the button, but the product actually has a DID document and signs, and therefore there is no biometric. If we want to say, hey, there's an audit trail back to who the maintainers at the time of hitting the button, that's an interesting discussion point.
Yeah, well, software's got a genealogy and a set of DNA as well. So I think that's I think it's useful to think of a piece of software as an entity that cannot be corrupted if we give it verifiable credentials. So anyway, that's it. I know we're out of time. I apologize. Thanks.
I put in the chat the what I thought might be the link that you're referring to, Hannes, which is the NIST SP 800-623-3 document. Is that the one you're thinking of?
Yes. Thanks.
Okay. So it's an interesting document. Okay, just extending that conversation about the voter. The thing there is that you can never delete a record in the voter database. It can be canceled, it can be amended and so forth, but no one gets to delete those. And so when they say, you have sometimes too many records or too many voters and so forth, it's usually a misunderstanding of what happens with that. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention one thing before we go, is that with Kay leaving Microsoft, I've asked Christina Yashuda to step in as program manager for Microsoft's efforts in SCITT and help me and Cedric and Antoine. I do believe her expertise in identity and what's happening on the IETF in those areas is worthwhile having her in these discussions, which is why I've asked Ori to reach out to her.
That's awesome. Thank you, Roy. That'll be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Roy. I have to bail out, so and we are actually already running overtime. So I suggest you stop here, and I will send down the meeting minutes to the mailing list, and we see each other or hear each other next week on Monday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.